Please open your Bibles to Nehemiah chapter 6. I was doing some extreme vacuuming yesterday and kind of threw out my back. So if I just collapse here and stay in a fetal position for a couple of seconds, don't worry, I'm not having a seizure. Truth be told, I was actually just putting the vacuum away. I wasn't even vacuuming. Those things happen. So Nehemiah chapter 6, we will cover verses 1 through verse 15 of this new chapter. And here we will go back to this real-time chronology that we had been experiencing till last week. If you recall last week, whether you were here or hopefully if you weren't, you were able to catch up in our videos online, Nehemiah took a step back and he showed what occurred during a period of 12 years, his record in office. But now we are focusing back in and we are experiencing the things that are happening pretty much real time. And what we see here in this 6th chapter is that the wall essentially is all finished. Everything except the gates. The gates needed to be hung, but the actual structure of the wall, it was pretty much complete. So going back to that analogy that I used a few weeks ago of a marathon. If you recalled a few weeks ago, the people were a little discouraged because they were halfway through and it seems like there's just so much more to work, and they were again in need of some encouraging. Here it's almost done. The marathon, basically you had got a mile to go and you can see the finish line and you just need a little bit more, which in certain regards, it's actually even more dangerous from the perspective of finishing this project. As we know, in anything that you do in life, it is a lot easier to start well than it is to end well. For whatever reason, it is very easy to start well because we are excited, we are energized, we are passionate, but then to end something well, again, it's a little bit more difficult. And I believe that the devil knows that. The devil understands that weakness in human beings, so that all throughout there may be challenges, but especially towards the very end, I believe that when he wants to hinder something, that he is very knowledgeable as far as how to distract and to attack those who are trying to finish. And here, again, it's a little bit of that. They were almost done. And we will see attacks from the enemies, followed by responses from Nehemiah. We've seen this before, and we'll continue to see this. And one thing that I would like to highlight is the fact that Nehemiah, he used discernment from above to be able to deal with these attacks right as they were heading towards the finish line. So let's go ahead and read. I'll read and you can follow along. Again, Nehemiah chapter 6 from verse 1 through verse 15. Now it happened when Sanballat, Tobiah, Geshem the Arab, and the rest of our enemies heard that I had rebuilt the wall and that there were no breaks left in it, though at that time I had not hung the doors in the gates, that Sanballat and Geshem sent to me, saying, "Come, let us meet together among the villages in the plain of Ono." But they thought to do harm. So I sent messengers to them, saying, I am doing a great work so that I cannot come down. Why should the work cease while I leave it and go down to you? But they sent me this message 4 times, and I answered them in the same manner. Then Sanballat sent his servant to me as before the 5th time with an open letter in his hand. In it was written, "It is reported among the nations, and Geshem says, that you and the Jews plan to rebel. Therefore, according to these rumors, you are rebuilding the wall, that you may be their king. And you have also appointed prophets to proclaim concerning you at Jerusalem, saying, there is a king in Judah. Now these matters will be reported to the king. So come therefore, and let us consult together." Verse 8. "Then I sent to him, saying, no such thing as you say are being done, but you invent them in your own heart. For they all were trying to make us afraid, saying their hands will be weakened in the work, and it will not be done. Now, therefore, O God, strengthen my hands." Afterwards, I came to the house of Shemaiah, the son of Delaiah, the son of Mehetabel, who was a secret informer, and he said, "Let us meet together in the house of God within the temple, and let us close the door of the temple, for they are coming to kill you. Indeed, at night they will come to kill you." And I said, "Should such a man as I flee? And who is there such as I who would go into the temple to save his life? I will not go in." Then I perceived that God had not sent him at all, but that he pronounced this prophecy against me because Tobiah and Sanballat had hired him. For this reason he was hired, that I should be afraid and act that way in sin, so that they might have cause for an evil report, that they might reproach me. My God, remember Tobiah and Sanballat according to their work, and the prophetess Noadiah, and the rest of the prophets who would have made me afraid. So the wall was finished on the 25th day of Elul, in 52 days. Amen. So again, we are close to the finish line. Just a little bit more work to do. Just the gates needed to be hung. The enemies see this, and they are doing a last-ditch effort to try to impede the work from being completed. And initially, what we see is an attack in a form of friendliness. The enemies of Nehemiah, they sent servants and essentially inviting him for a gathering, and it seemed again very friendly, very cordial. This location, the plain of Ono, it was in the outskirts of Benjamin, which essentially is within Judah, so about 25 to 30 miles away. And they were pretending once more to be friends of Nehemiah. We just want to get together. We just want to have a chit-chat. Now, as I mentioned before, every time they try to impede or attack Nehemiah from completing his work, he essentially utilized discernment from above to try to counter these attacks. So the initial way that he countered this was simply to provide a response that was equally polite. Again, it was just a polite invitation. And every time they invited him to have these meetings, they did so 4 times. He said, "Look, we have a lot of work to do. I am a busy man. Should I stop everything to go and have these meetings with you? I can't. I'm sorry. I wish I could." Have you ever done that? I really wish I could meet with you, but I can't because, again, I'm a very busy man. And as I've stated before, this actually took a considerable amount of discernment And since we're talking about discernment here, I even made a little definition here, which essentially for our case here and for the benefit of our study, it's the ability to judge matters according to God's perspective, which is oftentimes broader than the world's perspective or a human perspective. Oftentimes you are able to see the big picture. Oftentimes it is so much deeper than a shallow perspective. And this is a God-given ability. There is actually a list of certain gifts in 1 Corinthians chapter 12. And one of those gifts, it's the ability to discern spirits. Now, there's a debate regarding what that actually means, but most people understand that that is a God-given ability to distinguish between truth and the truth-like deceptions of the devil. Again, this is a God-given ability to be able to distinguish between truth, in other words, God's way of viewing a particular situation, versus the enemy's truth-like perspective. Why is it truth-like? Because oftentimes it's very hard for us to distinguish between both of them because they're pretty close. But because we are in need of discernment, God endows us with that. Again, it is a spiritual gift, and much like any other gift, it needs to be exercised, it needs to be searched for, and once you have it, obviously you need to use it. And it seems like Nehemiah is at a place where this is building up, and he's utilizing this discernment that is coming from above. So once more, after this polite request, this friendly request for a meeting, he just politely responded saying, I can't, because he understood that they were up to no good. So they follow that up with another type of attack. The first one was pretty friendly, as I've stated before, but now it gets a little unfriendly, if you will. And let me read that section once more. So now we are in verse 5, and here it says, Then Sanballat sent his servants to me as before, the fifth time, with an open letter in his hand. In it was written, It is reported among the nations, and Geshem says that you and the Jews plan to rebel. Therefore, according to these rumors, you are rebuilding the wall that you may be their king, and you have also appointed prophets to proclaim concerning you at Jerusalem, saying, there is a king in Judah. Now, these matters will be reported to the king, so come therefore and let us consult together. So now they go from friendly requests to false claims. The friendliness did not work. It was countered by a discernment and a response, and now they are essentially utilizing another tactic. Here we have somewhat vague allegations. He mentioned here that it was reported among the nations. So who reported these things again? What exactly are they saying? Also, there is a personal accusation here that you may be king, that you are appointing prophets for that purpose. And he follows that up with baseless threats, right? These matters will be reported to the king. So it's getting a little bit intense here. Things are getting a little harder. But as we saw before, Nehemiah is going to utilize discernment, and the discernment here is basically a pretty much a straightforward answer to these false accusations. We don't see Nehemiah over-explaining things, which is great, because when you are not at fault, you don't need to over-explain things. You simply need to state the truth, and he stated the truth from verse 8 by saying, Then I sent
to him, saying, "No such things as you say are being done, but you invent them in your own heart." And that's it. That was the response. That was very direct. It was very, very simple. It wasn't, embellished with a bunch of other information. Simply, you are wrong. You're inventing these things. But again, utilizing discernment, he actually was able to understand the enemy's strategy. And what was the enemy's strategy? The enemy wanted to instigate fear upon Nehemiah and the people. Again, on verse 9, "For they all were trying to make us afraid." Now, why were they trying to make Nehemiah and the other people afraid? Again, they're almost crossing the finish line. They're almost there. And prior to crossing the finish line, if they can make the people afraid of all of these, again, false claims, then they are hoping that they will stop on their tracks. And this seems actually pretty unrealistic, right? If you've ran almost an entire marathon, you're almost there, why would you stop before crossing the finish line? Well, that actually happens pretty often, pretty regularly, maybe not specifically during a marathon, but how often are we almost there and we know that we must do something? We know that we have a godly duty, so we've thought about it. We've worked it in our heads and in our hearts, but then we either hear word or we imagine something negative happening as a byproduct of doing that which we must do. Because we are afraid of what people may say, we are afraid of what people may think, and we think twice. Should I really do this? Is it right? Am I able to finish that which I started in my head and in my heart? And obviously the answer is yeah. You should not be afraid just because some people may think something or they may say something that is fictitious, that there are lies, that they will misinterpret what you are trying to do. If you believe that you are doing that which is right, you should complete it. You should not freeze because you are afraid of the potential negative consequences of doing what is right. And again, Nehemiah was discerning these things. He understood the enemy's plots or ploys. He understood what they were trying to accomplish. And now they go on with another attack. As I mentioned, it was threefold. So now here on verse 10, this one was most likely the most impressive. Now here they really get tricky. Look at what is happening on verse 10. "Afterwards, I came to the house of Shemaiah, the son of Delaiah, the son of Mehetabel, who was a secret informer, and he said, 'Let us meet together in the house of God,'" in other words, in the temple, "'within the temple, and let us close the doors of the temple, for they are coming to kill you. Indeed, at night they will come to kill you.'" So Nehemiah goes to this person who was the son of another person and another person who we know nothing of. Most likely it was a high-ranking spiritual official, a priest of some kind. And here he was thought of as a prophet, right? Somebody who can speak on behalf of God, see things that other people do not see. And he told Nehemiah that they were going to try to kill him, and for him to save his life. How could Nehemiah save his life? He would simply enter the temple, close the doors, and hide until these people went away. And Nehemiah concluded, after putting some thought into this, most likely it took him a while to sort of dissect this proposition, that it was not right for him to do so. It wasn't godly for him to run away, to hide into the temple, and he perceived that what they were actually saying was falsehood. If he hid, he essentially would be acting like someone who was guilty of something. Innocent people do not hide. But not only that, he would actually be doing something that went against godly norms. And we see in the law that only certain people could go into the temple where he was, actually being enticed to go. The priest, the high priest, and only in very few portions of the religious calendar. So not only would he be perceived as a coward, lose all authority amongst his people, but he would actually be sinning against God. Again, if he followed these instructions or these directions. So he knew not to fall for their ploy, and this last-ditch effort did not succeed. And on verse 14, he simply states here, "My God, remember Tobiah and Sanballat according to these their works, and the prophetess Noadiah, and the rest of the prophets who would have made me afraid." Essentially, he just committed them to God and said, God, take care of the situation. I'm not going to fall for these tactics. I'm not going to run away. I'm not going to fear doing that which is right. I'm going to keep on going. As I've stated before, the enemy was tricky here. Again, they were almost crossing the finish line. And we see how much effort was put into derailing their success. How intense the temptation was. How much time they were utilizing so that Nehemiah, the workers, and the work would not be successful. And now, stepping back a little bit and thinking about what is happening here, I want to make a couple of conclusions. Initially, let's go ahead and read the following verse, which is somewhat of the climax of it all. Verse 15, "So the wall was finished on the 25th day of Elul in 52 days. It is amazing that this wall was built in 52 days. Why is it amazing? As we have stated before, it was unfinished for about 100 years. But I don't even think that is the most amazing thing, thinking about the difference between 100 years and 52 days. I believe that the most amazing things regarding Nehemiah was the fact that in the beginning, do you recall what he did initially? He prayed for 4 months. And now he spent 2 months actually doing the work. Look at that ratio. Isn't that uncommon? When we think of doing things, when we think of challenging things, when we have those to-do lists of life, and we perceive that they are so almost unsurmountable, so challenging, so difficult, and we know that we should rely upon God, and we think, maybe I should pray over this a little bit. How often do you pray twice as long as the actual action? Not very often. Usually you pray a little bit, but then it's just, you go to work.
and it might take a very long time. But the ratios, the proportions, usually it's nowhere near this. He was literally praying for 4 months, and it took him half of that time to actually do the work. That is amazing to me. I'm nowhere near this. But this is such a great example, because what we see here, it's that to Nehemiah, the work started when he began to pray. Usually we think of that as a precursor to the work, or as an addendum, the preface. But actually, Nehemiah understood, look, I have no idea how long the wall is going to take to be built. But the process starts here, in prayer. And he was diligent in that. So to me, that is amazing. But there's something else here that I want to point to, that I want to highlight. And it's what Nehemiah said in that 3rd verse. And this is actually a pretty popular verse. I just kind of went through it kind of quickly when we initially looked at this section. But his response to their initial inquiry, their invitation to the friendly meeting. Look at Nehemiah's response. So I sent messengers to them, saying, I am doing a great work, so that I cannot come down. Why should the work cease while I leave it and go down to you? Again, I am doing a great work, so that I cannot come down. You've probably read this verse before, maybe in a devotional, maybe in another type of Bible study. Again, it's a pretty well-known verse, and usually the gist of it, when people utilize it for those purposes, it's an encouragement to continue to work and put everything else to the side. Don't stop working. Don't get discouraged. Don't get attracted to other, flashy, blinking lights. Squirrel. But if you actually look at what transpired here, this was somewhat of an excuse. Wouldn't you agree? Why do I say this? Just prior to the section, the work stopped. Seemingly stopped. Why? Because there were certain internal problems that Nehemiah had to deal with. And we spent a couple of weeks talking about the fact that certain people are greedy, so we had no word of actual work being done while Nehemiah was dealing with that situation. And we know that the work had stopped prior to this. So now Nehemiah is saying, look, the work cannot stop. I cannot have a meeting with you. It's not that Nehemiah is lying, but he's utilizing that as an excuse because he knew better. It was a polite invitation, so he responded in a polite manner, again, by saying, look, I wish I could. It's only 25 miles away. It's not that big a deal, but I'm really focused upon the work. And the work cannot stop. And they continued to request this meeting, and he continued to respond in a similar way. I'm sorry, I'm kind of busy. And to me, that's important, because even though this is somewhat of an excuse, it's an awesome excuse. It's the best type of excuse in the world. Why? Because keeping busy, especially doing God's work, it's a great excuse not to fall for the devil's traps. Now, we can rely upon self-control. We can rely upon, the discernment and these spiritual gifts that God gives us, and we need to work them out and progress in them. But oftentimes, we're not quite there. And we need somewhat of a crutch. We need a little bit of help, again, building up those other types of gifts. And hopefully we can get to a point where we can just be so strong in our faith that we can just have this amount of self-control that
temptation does not even faze us. But until we are at that place, you know what is a great tactic? You know what is a great tool? Keep busy. Keep busy, especially doing God's work. Because temptation will come. And it comes very often, and especially in very strategic periods of our life when the devil, who is very cunning, when he knows when to intensify his attacks. And in that moment in time, when these temptations come, if we are just busy doing God's work in our family, in our church, in our communities, we can legitimately respond to these temptations by saying, wow, that is amazing. That is so enticing. Wonderful even, but you know what? I can't. I wish I could, but I can't. Why? I'm going to have to pass because I'm kind of busy right now. Isn't that a great excuse not to fall and not to sin? As opposed to just staying there stagnant, relying upon, again, that amount of self-control that ultimately will hinder or counter the devil's tactics. So here's the encouragement. Keep busy. Oftentimes that is harder to do than to say, or the inverse of that, but you know what I mean. But try to the best of your ability to keep busy. Because if you are not busy, then these types of attacks will be that much harder to counter. And maybe, just maybe, you've ran 23 miles in your marathon, and the finish line is right there. But then you take a break, and you rest, and you get sidetracked. And unfortunately, all of that work was for naught. Do not fall for that. Keep busy, especially busy doing God's work. Amen.